This Pragmatic Works webinar today. We're real excited to present the topic of data governance and how it corresponds to Azure SQL database. So let's go ahead and get started. A little bit about me. Well, the agenda today is going to be about me, intro to Azure data governance, and then we'll have a demo and then a quick summary and any questions. So first of all, yeah, the polls is pretty indicative. A lot of companies are starting to migrate to the data governance for very good reasons, and this webinar will hopefully tell you why it's so important. So I'm a principal consultant for Pragmatic Works. I've been working with data since '96, and I've been consulting full-time for 6 years. Prior to that, since 2000, part-time here and there for different clients throughout the area. I live in the Tampa Bay region, been here since '82. Prior to that, I lived in New York. Excuse me. So, a brief description about data governance and why it's risen to the top of the heap, in my opinion. It slowly crept into the limelight for good reason. Data privacy, the framework that gets in place within your organization will fortify the efforts to becoming a data-driven organization. And data-driven organization is a hot word lately because it's true. The data is an asset, and the reason it's an asset is because you can leverage that data to make better decisions. And obviously having reports and dashboards and scorecards are great, but the end result is you have to make decisions, and those decisions will help increase sales perhaps, or reduce cost and streamline processes. So we'll go ahead and get started. Data governance at the enterprise level, it's a organized, consistent, proper handling of your data. And the reason you want to do that is so you ensure accuracy, so the business trusts your reports. And I find that a lot of times you have better luck introducing the data governance when you have trickle-down acceptance from the top, as in the CIO or the CEO or what have you. But I always found that if you have the buy-in at the top, it usually flows better than trying to push it upstream. Because from experience, there have been meetings from time to time where you'll show up for a meeting and perhaps people will, have a report, and that report may get questioned, and the majority of the meeting is spent, trying to defend yourself on why your numbers are accurate. So obviously, having accurate reports is a key thing, and enterprise data governance is a definite mechanism to get there. So with data governance, there's really three aspects: the people, the processes, and the applications. And we'll get into that in more detail with the various roles that have risen up over time, including the data steward, a few others, and we'll get to that in a minute. Another thing is having the centralized data ecosystem in place so that it's accurate and accountable, and there's a lot of good reasons why we have the enterprise data governance. And so why do we have data governance? Well, data has grown tremendously, and with that we need to instill best practices. So what does that entail? Well, naming conventions, how you handle the data, naming, just consistency, how the data flows through the system, where do you store your business logic, how the reports are handled, are they exported to a network share, are they distributed on the cloud where people have access, and how do you govern that access? You also want people know what to expect. Let's move forward. So another thing is the organization. Worse than having volumes of data scattered throughout the organization, silos where people don't know, where the data is coming from, how the data landed in that report. It's nice to have organization, consistency, transparency, and obviously security with all the activity with missing information or what have you, breaches. Security is important, but not just from the external world, but also in regards to internal world. For example, you may have sensitive data that you don't want certain people seeing, such as social security or salary or quota information. So security is definitely bundled into the data governance aspect. Another nice thing is a point of ownership and responsibility. There's the old question of who owns the data. Well, IT owns it because they store the database on the server and they own the server, so they're responsible for the ownership, the responsibility. But the business owns the data perhaps because they understand the data. They're the ones who use it day in and day out. They know what the definition of a customer is or a product or what have you. So all this sums up to a data-driven organization. And like we talked about, increased sales, reduced cost, automation, streamlining processes, and consistent documented process. So new people coming into the org can get up to speed real quick. So we talked about a lot right there, but I just want to say, I started out with Crystal Reports 5.0 back in '96. And at that time, essentially we had a single query. Maybe it had a few joins, single database, single user that requested the report. Perhaps a VP in another department said, hey, I understand you have access to the data. Could you get me a quick report? Sure, yeah, I'll get that in a half hour. He's happy. So yeah, it was a lot simpler back then in '96. And also like you work on a $3 million project, you have developers and project managers flying in from all over, and you have these meetings with 100 people go around the room, and at the end they say, oh, I think we need reports. Shouldn't we have someone create reports? So reporting was kind of an afterthought in the early days, at least for me, and I'm sure going back to the mainframe days, where the COBOL developer was responsible for the application, the database, the logic, and they did everything. But when I came along into the reporting world, it was pretty simple. And then obviously over time, things got more complex. So how so? Well, we introduced cubes and aggregation and slicing of the data. So that added some complexity. Then we added dashboards. We had cloud, big data, unstructured data. Well, what's that? Well, that's data that doesn't comply with a structured data set. It's dynamic. It changes on the fly. You don't know what you're getting until the data lands, and then you mount like a view or a table on top. Well, all that had to be considered and applied to the reporting world. So suffice to say, data has risen to the top of the heap, and with the complexity, we need to introduce rules and frameworks to govern that data, and data governance is the solution to that complexity. Otherwise, it's chaos. So one of the new roles that's come about is called the data steward, and essentially they're responsible for the data quality within the org. And by that, there's always fat finger typing, where like a web field, a text box where people type in like free form, and perhaps they entered some embedded character, or perhaps they put a string in a date field, or a string in an integer or float or what have you. So they're responsible for the accuracy, the completeness, and the consistency of the data. And these are some of the responsibilities of that data steward. And rightly so, they have some responsibility, and perhaps they're responsible for a single data set or multiple departments. And typically, well, sometimes it's a specified role within the organization, perhaps a bigger organization, but other times, perhaps people wear double hats. So maybe the accounting director is also the data steward for their domain, or perhaps the billing is responsible for theirs, or the marketing is responsible for theirs. So sometimes they wear multiple hats, but still they're responsible to make sure that the data that they're sending out is accurate. Another thing is the data custodian. Typically the DBA, from traditional, the DBA owned everything, and they administered the rights and the permissions, and if you're lucky, you got access to the database, and as long as you didn't run some rogue query that slowed down production. But also they play a key impact today in the data custodian. Also the ETL developers. Well, you have a set of data here and you have a report here. Well, how did that data land in the report? Well, an ETL developer constructed the data such that business rules were added, and those business rules were documented, and they're basically the custodians of that data. And these are some of the responsibilities that fall on the custodian. You can read through some of this detail here, but essentially the movement of data, perhaps, or the storage of data, or the transport. So you have the data stewards, and you have the data custodians. And that may not be a formal role where, say, like, what do you do? I'm a data custodian. It may be just be a responsibility added to an existing position. Now, the Chief Data Officer is also a fairly new position, and you find them in mid to large organizations because it is a dedicated position with some amount of authority, and a lot of times in the hierarchy, they may report to the top officials such as the CEO, the CFO, or the CIO. And sometimes they're standalone. I mean, they have a lot of responsibility. So what do? You know, I would say they align the data strategy. Like, here's our data ecosystem. Here's all the components. Let me document every database, who has access to what, you know, what software we're using, what vendors. There's instances where perhaps there's like 11 different software tools within the org, and each one has an associated cost. There's also a hidden cost where you have to have developers that know how to use the tools, and sometimes developers leave, and how are you going to backfill that position with this software that's maybe difficult to use or hard to get up and running. So there's a lot of there's some cost savings by consolidating those 11 reporting tools perhaps into a few or one. And then you also talk about cross vendors. You know, each vendor offers similar products, and having multiple, there may be some cost savings in you know, cutting the list down to 2 or 3 or 1 perhaps. And there's definite cost savings, and I know in today's day and age, cost savings is a huge thing. Another thing is to build in-house or third-party or a mix, because a lot of times you find these in-house applications, you can really customize them as long as you document them so that the next developer can come in and learn them. But then there's also advantages of the third-party software where you just go out and buy it, you pay the licenses, the maintenance agreement, and so the Chief Data Officer is charged with that responsibility. And then lastly, the CDO has the ability to leverage in the internal staff, such as, let's say we're working on a project for accounting. Well, we can matrix in some of the accounting folks so that we can gather their information and knowledge to make a solid product. And they're kind of like the expert. And if you have a question, you go to the expert. And by matrixing, in some of the organizations, you can actually like charge that time back to their department, which is a nice feature, rather than just pulling them in for ad hoc meetings. But there, you can definitely apply some structure to that. And then we have master data management, excuse me, which is basically, it's a way to organize your data with consistent framework. And excuse me, what you can do is remove the duplicates. For example, you know, you have multiple records for the same customer in a dimension table. They can go through and you know, standardize that. You can also add rules to eliminate incorrect data. I know using data quality services in the past, it's a good feature for looking at the data, and I know I worked on a project one time where we had some data that had addresses, and there must have been 72 ways to spell St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg or STP or St. Pete or SAINT, you know. So by using the tools that are pre-existing, designed specifically for cleaning up your data, that's a good aspect of the master data management. So with the data, you have data consolidation, you have data federation, and data propagation. So you can read that on the screen there. Also, another, in my opinion, one of the biggest features of the data ecosystem is the data catalog. It may not get as much attention as it needs to, but I feel that the data catalog is a huge investment into your organization to become a data-driven org. And the reason is, what it does, you document all your data sources. You may have SQL Server or Oracle, Sybase, unstructured data sets. You may have data that's scraped off the web, all sorts of data. Well, all that data is just living out there, you know, in silos. And what the data catalog does, it wraps some structure around your processes. So you can say, well, I have these 28 databases. This is where they reside. This is who, you could get into more detail with who maintains it, what is the structure of the data, what is the purpose. And what it does, you have a consolidated, consistent warehouse of information, of metadata. For example, you'll say 182 tables, and these are the fields, and these are the field types, and here's a brief description. And what that does is allow people within your organization to go through the data catalog and find out, well, I need to know where the address is. So you could query your data catalog and find, well, here's a few tables that have that information. Now, another nice thing about documenting the data is that you may have a report, and the report pulls from a table from a database, and you want to know what were the steps, what were the hops of that data that landed to become that field in that report. For example, you may have a data warehouse that resides in Azure SQL database, and before that it was in Azure SQL. Before that it was in blob storage. Before that it was on-premise in a SQL Server database, and the application is used for ERP. So you could document the data along the trail, so you can, for example, doing ETL, a lot of times there's errors, and you want to know where did that error occur. Well, if you had that lineage on how that field was derived or what calculations were used in that, the data catalog can capture a lot of that information, and it's very, very beneficial. And I feel like the data catalog is the missing glue that holds everything together. And there's some really nice products out there. I know Azure Data Catalog is a good one, but also there's other ones that are incorporating some of this new AI stuff that perhaps scan web logs, or they scan the databases to see which fields are most occurring. So there's a lot of opportunities to the data catalog within your org. I highly recommend. Another feature is the regulatory compliance, because there are existing rules and new rules coming down the pike that mandate that you handle your data in such a way that you comply with the regulations. Everybody knows HIPAA data. If you go to the doctor, you have to fill out forms, and all that data gets ingested into the database. And there are certain rules in place that you must comply with or face penalties. So with that said, earlier in the conversation, we talked about how data was an afterthought, and perhaps one user wanted to, and there was no structure. But the new way of doing things is to incorporate the data as the basis of your ecosystem, so that reporting becomes easier. So you have to put data at the top of the list instead of the bottom. So what are some of the regulatory compliances? Well, HIPAA. Working in a healthcare, you cannot just email an Excel document report that has customer information or HIPAA or personal identifiable information. So there's penalties for that. Another one is the PCI with the credit card regulations. I know I worked on a few projects with that, and there's some very specific rules and way of doing things, and how you handle that data, how long you retain it. Are you able to have a list of data? So there's a lot of rules regarding the payment information, the credit card information. Another one you may have heard about is the GDPR, which is basically protection of consumer data within Europe, but it affects everyone, because you may have customers that actually live in Europe, and they could request information on how that data is being used, how long you're going to retain it, who's had access to it, has that data been provided to third parties, and there are serious consequences for not complying with these rules. So the rules are very specific, and the complexity is something that you really have to put some effort into it, and not just the IT folks having a 2-hour meeting one day and say, go off and create me a solution for GDPR. You have to include perhaps the counsel, the lawyers, or the people that can decipher some of the rules and such, so that it's quite a large effort. and it shouldn't be taken lightly. And obviously, some of those rules are going to trickle down to United States. I know Canada's already started with some of those similar rules to protect the consumer data, because the consumer does have rights, and they have to know how their data is being used, how long it's being kept, and if it's been released to anybody. Like we were talking about earlier, the personal identifiable information, some of that data is restricted, and you should be able to identify which fields are PII, perhaps in the data catalog. And this is what I was talking about. The United States does have some rules in effect. They're not 100% consistent across the board, so you could probably guess that eventually we'll have similar. Another one that I've worked on a project recently is internally sensitive data. So in an organization, you may have data that you don't want everyone to see. For example, salary information. It may not be illogical for everyone to see everyone's salary, perhaps, and also maybe, excuse the background there, sales quotas, like, oh, Fred in the sales department sold $6 million last week, or perhaps that's information they shouldn't see. Financial data, customer data, address information. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons why you want to incorporate security in regards to to protect the customer's data, and also just internal rules in general. So how does that affect Azure, and how does that cross over into the world of data on the Azure side? Well, Azure is a great product, and in regards to the data ecosystem, we're talking about 3 layers of protection. So I know when cloud first appeared, there was a lot of concern regarding security, and say, oh, I'm not going to move my data to the cloud because I don't trust it. Well, we've come a long way since then, and obviously there's a lot of smart people working on the protection of the data, and what we have here is we protect the data, they control the access, and we monitor the activity, using the Azure site. So the first one is protect the data. We have transparent data encryption using certificate or key. We have always encrypted, and we have encryption in transit, in memory, on disk, and while you're querying. We also we control the access. The first layer you could use is Azure Active Directory. Another one is row-level security, and we have a quick demo on that, on how simple it is to use. And when you apply the row-level security, if you're querying from Management Studio or anywhere really, as long as the user ID credentials are passed in, it knows how to handle it properly. So that's good. And then another nice feature with the Azure Active Directory is that you can belong to a group or a role, and you could add 100 people to that role, and they all have similar access levels, read only, read write, or even tied to the security level in regards to data masking and row level security. And we use predicates to assign that row level security within the Azure SQL. Another nice feature about the Azure, what they offer out of the box, is called dynamic data masking. And essentially it kind of like puts a wrapper on top of the data for specific users or groups or roles, and it'll hide the information. For example, social, it'll mask out the first 3 to 5 characters, the phone number you can mask, the credit card number you can mask, the dates you can mask. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can mask, and that's out of the box, and that's a real nice feature. Obviously, we can monitor the activity of what's going on within the Azure site, and these are some of the ways you can do that. We can also apply firewalls. It's pretty much out of the box. When you try to connect to the SQL server, you have to specify your firewall so let your queries flow through. You can manage the permissions, folder in the reporting. You can assign specific folders, for example, Power BI, and give access to specific users. And the connections are encrypted. So with that said, I'd like to just go and open up the Management Studio, which a lot of you are familiar with. And, well, let me just backtrack for a second. I'll go through the details of how we created this quick database in Azure, and just have a quick documentation here. So when you log on to the Azure Suite, you click New, and then we chose the SQL database, and then we named the database, and there's some features that you can select based on cost and also server location. So we chose the South Central, entered password, user ID, and it started deploying. Excuse me, it deployed. And excuse me, let me jump over to the demo real quick. Thank you. So what we have here on the left-hand side is basically we connected to the Azure database. And this is the URL or the entry that we have to enter to connect to this database. And those are that's the user that we assigned and the password. So basically, once we're connected, we have a generic database out here for no particular reason. We chose this one here, and it has tables, and you can actually query these tables from Management Studio. And when you execute the query, it's actually going up to the cloud, pulling the data and returning it. So I think that's kind of cool. And let's go ahead and get started. But what I like to do is to demonstrate two features in one. And what are those? Well, it's the row-level security as well as the data masking within Azure. So essentially, we'll go ahead and create this table real quick. And it completed. So we have a table with a bunch of fields, and looks like mostly varchars. And what we did was we masked this field last name as default. We masked the first name, and we masked all these fields here. And you can see the social is going to be 3 and 2 and 4. So what it'll do, it should display the last 4 characters, because obviously people's social security shouldn't be for everybody in the company to look at. So we'll go ahead and insert 3 records. And then we'll go ahead and create a schema within Azure. And next, this is the predicate that is assigned for row-level security. So essentially, you're creating a function, and it's schema binding. It's got a name and a user name as the parameter, and it's attached to the DBO. Well, essentially, let me just translate what it's doing. You pass in the username, jbloom, and it says, okay, jbloom has access, or if the username is DBO, the owner of the table, database. So let's say somebody tries to query the query to that table, and they do not have access. I mean, their username does not equal, and well, they're not going to get access to that row. Even still, let's say there's 3 rows, and jbloom only has assigned to 1 row. It's going to bypass the 2 rows and only display the 1 row. So that's how that works. Okay, cool. Next, we apply the policy, and you give it a name and you assign it a table. The next thing I like to do is to add these 3 test users. Basically, we're just creating some dummy test users for testing purposes. And now that the table's been created, the data's been ingested, the 3 rows, and we've assigned a user, I'm just going to run this query standalone as is. And guess what? There's 3 rows down here at the bottom. And you can see the username, the last name, the phone, the email, and you can see all those values are transparent. They're right there on the screen. So now let's go ahead and test it as test user 1. What it's going to do is it's going to map it to this user field here, and it should only return 1 row. Secondly, because this user, the data, well, let's go ahead and run it and see what we get. So there you go. You get 1 row because the row level security is intact. Secondly, it applied the data masking as expected. So if I was to copy this and put it in Excel and send it to somebody, they can't see the data. So that's how that works. Now, the underlying data is still intact. Like I said, because if you run the query as non-test, well, guess what? The data's still there. So that's a great feature out of the box with Azure. And we'll go ahead and run another one. And guess what? 1 row masked. And excuse me, if we wanted to see which fields have masking within the database, we can run this query here. And guess what? There's your fields and there's your masking. And those got defined up here when we defined the table. You say, well, that's great and all, but I'd like to drop the masking on the social security number. So let's go ahead and execute the query. And then we can, excuse me, we'll run it again. And guess what? The social is no longer masked. So that's how easy it is. But another thing, let me see if my Azure is still connected, please. Let's see if it timed out. Dynamic data masking right here. So where we are, we're on the Azure suite. We're within the SQL database, and we're going to click on the Azure data masking. and it looks like I'm still logged in. And guess what? It tells you ahead of time which fields are masked. And you can actually click on it from here, and then you would click the delete button, and then you would have to save it. Well, we can go ahead and do that now. I deleted it and now saved it. So let's go back to the Management Studio real quick and run that same query. And sure enough, we only have 3 now. So you can see how easy it is. You can control it through the T-SQL, or you can control it through the web. And it's that easy. And you can really grow upon this simple example. I just wanted to show you, how easy it is to use out of the box and everything. And it is fairly easy, and it's powerful. And like I said, if you have some internal rules, for example, like a sales quota, and you say, well, we'll sign a role, and the manager will have access to everything, as well as the director, and each of the salespeople can only see their information. So what you would do is you would apply one of these rules here to that table, and you could also create like a lookup table and have all the rules predefined, so Fred would only have access to Fred's sales, and Bob would have access to his sales. So it's pretty powerful, and it gets around a lot of the issues of security and row-level security and data masking. So that's a great feature. Okay, we'll go back to I think I need slide 50. So here we are, and ooh, that's good. Anyway, all I was going to do is summarize here, and what we did was we talked about data governance, why we have data governance, what are some of the methodologies of the frameworks, and we talked about that. We talked about the security, and we talked about the masking and the row-level security. So I would say that data governance is a huge component within the data ecosystem. It's grown from the bottom of the heap to the top, and for good reason, because we really need to apply structure to our data, or we're just going to have chaos. And anybody who's been working in the data field for a while will probably agree, or if they haven't seen the light, they probably will, especially with those new rules coming down the pipe to comply with the regulations and everything. So that's all I really have, and I'll throw up the question board here, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer. So thank you again, and I'll open the floor. If anyone has any questions, please.
Hey, John, it looks like you have a few questions in here. I don't know if you can see them on your end, or if you want me to just go ahead and read them off to you. It's up to you.
Yeah. Okay, it's under the questions. I see.
And you can make it bigger if you just click the little square with the arrow coming out of it.
I see. Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so attached to the Azure Active Directory, meaning access to data could be restricted based on Active Directory. Yes, so I'm sorry. The question is, can we assign permissions and all that based on the Active Directory? And yes, I would agree with that, assuming that you connect the Azure Active Directory to your on-prem. What happens is you can, I think is it the Kerberos that you have to set up? But once it's configured, you can assign those users to roles, and those roles can be used dynamically to limit the data. Like I said, you could structure and architect your entire organization to use those rules. Well, the CEO has access to everything, and the finance has access to theirs at the director level, then the manager marketing, and then the marketing individuals. So you can really get complex with your structure. So yeah, that's a good question, and that's one of the features that I like about. Another question, what's involved in building connection between source data and Azure? Wait, what's involved in building connection? Well, trying to understand. Moving the data to Azure, there's a lot of good ways to do that. Azure Data Factory, there's transaction replication, there's through individual SQL, through SSIS. There's a ton of ways to to get the data to Azure. Also with the Power BI, the data gateway. I'm not sure if I answered your question properly, but basically, what is the difference between data catalog and combined business glossary data dictionary? Well, I would say data dictionary is like in Excel perhaps, and it's kind of rudimentary where you just threw it together. Now the difficult part with keeping the data catalog within the Excel is, you know, it's real easy to create the thing the first time and throw it out on the network and say, hey, we have a data dictionary, but then 10 new fields are added, and who's responsible for that? Well, typically the data steward, but a lot of orgs, it's not always up to date or maintained. The nice thing about the data catalog in Azure is that it's current, and it's easier to work with. And the nice feature about it is you can do queries against it and all sort, and open it up to not just developers, but power users would probably want to see that so they can know where the fields are, so they can add it to the report. So yeah, data catalogs are awesome. Where are we? Was the row-level security attached to the Azure Active Directory? Well, in this case, in the I'll open up the we didn't use Active Directory. We just created 3 users, and those users I don't think they have login. Yeah, without login. So these are 3 generic users just for a test demo. And I may have grabbed this code off of one of the Microsoft Post quick examples, but essentially that's not tied to Azure Active Directory. That's just a custom user we created out of the box. So you could build upon that and tie it to the Active Directory. Okay, looks like a lot of questions. Looks like we still have some time. So what's involved in building a connection between source data and Azure? I think we answered that. There's multiple ways to get the data to the, or you mean tie it to the, you could essentially open SSMS and query the on-premise with the Azure by specifying the 4-part naming convention of the IP address server name, .schema, .table, .field, and do the joins in a single query. Okay, so this question, what have you discovered in terms of joining on columns that have masking applied versus those that do not? That's a good question. I'll have to go back and research it, but I'm trying to remember if the joins are applied correctly, but it is, you know, as long as it's not displayed to the screen. But I can definitely research that and get back. Alan, yeah. So I'll get with you on that one. Great question. Can the roles come from a user-created table? Well, like I was saying earlier, user-defined table. Let's say I had a table that contained a matrix of all the different tables or such, and then you could tie the roles and or user in that table, and then when you essentially that table would be used in a join within your query. So you select from person table, where the person equals the person in this lookup table, and then what it'll do, it'll collapse the rows so that they only see what they're supposed to see. So yes, you can do that. We've done that before. Next. Besides Azure Data Catalog, what other tools would you recommend for data cataloging? Man, there's a ton of them out there, and like I said, some of them are pretty advanced with the AI features that scan the web logs, and they scan the database logs to see which are the most used fields, and it dynamically changes over time. I feel like the data catalog is improving a lot, and I don't have any off the top of my head, but I know Azure Data Catalog is the approach that Azure is using, and it integrates tightly with the Azure suite, just like all the other tools. Is it possible to run stored procedures on Azure SQL database to import data from on-premises SQL database? Yes, I believe so. You can. Like I said, as long as you have the connection with the 4-part naming convention, I would say yes. There's also that cloud utility. I think it's here. the Azure Storage Explorer. That's a good one because we don't just move data from tables to tables. We may move a CSV file to the blob storage or the data lake. And from the data lake, we pull it into a staging table, and the staging goes into database, into data warehouse or analysis services. So there's a lot of movement of the data, and like I said, it's gotten more complicated, but there's a lot more opportunity for different variety of doing things. Also, the unstructured data, you may just move like a CSV file or a text file, and then you have to mount it and apply the delimiter, and that's all good. Why do we need to alter the data when we applied masking? Well, also, essentially, the reason we did that in the query is, like, we could just drop the table and rebuild it, but we can also just alter it. So it's two-line command. You just alter the table and apply the masking, and you can change the masking in real time. And like I said, you can also do it from the dynamic, from the screen here. So there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think this is the last question. Is there a preference for dynamic versus static data masking? Is one desired over the other? Wait, hold on. Well, you could have static data masking, perhaps make a copy of it and hide the real data. But the nice thing about this is that there's no, you just keep a single source of the data, and it's dynamic, and you can add or subtract on the fly. You can add complex rules so people can see certain values or not certain values. Maybe they only have access to North America and not South America. So you could, for the row level security, so you could easily change that with that custom table, or you could apply a modification to this predicate. So there's tremendous flexibility with these features, and it's a definite value add for the organization. And just to summarize, there's tremendous opportunity to become a data-driven organization through using the frameworks for data governance. And the companies that are going to get ahead the fastest are going to apply these rules, and it'll make a definite difference. So that's all I have really for today, and I want to thank everyone for attending. And I want to thank Pragmatic Works for letting me present today, and hope everyone enjoyed and got some value. And that's all I have, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you, John. We really appreciate it. And as for everybody else, this will be up on our website tomorrow, today at the latest, but you guys will all receive an email link tomorrow with the recording. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or John. And John, thank you again so much for hosting. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
No problem.
Have a great day.